In policy circles in Washington, D.C. and other capitals, on TV, in the media, almost all discussion about Syria takes place in some other universe divorced from reality. And the people talking haven't been to Syria recently, if ever, and have no idea what they're talking about. And most opinions and policies in place today have been formulated out of thin air, not through any process of empirical or logical or fact-based information gathering. At every level, Syria has exposed the failure of the international system and diplomacy.
You've just used your Iraq-speaking notes and put Syria in instead, haven't you?
It's even worse. It's even worse than what I saw in Iraq after 8 years. But as I'll get to, I mean, it's exposed the failure of the international system and diplomacy, humanitarian activity, conflict resolution, intervention, intelligence, covert and overt activities, and media coverage, which has been a disaster and is full of misinformation and propaganda and serves to obfuscate more than to enlighten. We're flooded with information about Syria, but none of it really improves our knowledge. Now, I left Syria 8 days ago, where I spent most of the last 3 years. I'm not Syrian, and I'm not going to claim to speak on behalf of Syrians, but I've acquired some amount of knowledge over that time. And 10 days ago, I was climbing through the rubble of old Homs, an area that I visited in all its phases, and the recent deal for old Homs was in part a result of the organization that I work for in our mediation between both sides. For 3 years, people have said that we should do something, wringing their hands and not knowing what to do. And in Washington, you can never go wrong calling for war. It's always easy to call for more war. It's an easy position. It lets you pretend that you have the moral high ground without having to take responsibility. So it's especially very convenient for London and Paris, for example, who want to see the Americans fight the war for them. But they're going to have to wait for the next administration because Obama's not interested in increased intervention in Syria. And policy has to be based on that reality. Many months are wasted on the myth of the Geneva process or the myth of pressuring the regime by changing the balance of power on the ground and changing their calculus. Everybody knew Geneva would fail, as I said earlier, that it couldn't lead to anything new because it's based on this silly notion that the regime is going to voluntarily engage in a process that ends their regime. So it's unlikely there's going to be any transitional body in Syria or any transitional process in Syria. As I said, unless Americans suddenly decide to attack Syria, that's not going to happen. The friends of Syria have not been its friends as a result. They've merely helped perpetuate a conflict, giving just enough to keep the fires burning instead of trying to put them out. Cynically, they prefer to watch thousands die rather than admit that their policies have been unachievable and are unachievable. They made promises to their Syrian friends that they never fulfilled, and whether it could have once made a difference is an academic question because it's probably too late now. Everybody claims to speak for the Syrian people and to be the sole representative of the Syrian people, but both sides actually just speak for a minority of the Syrian people. Some countries vow they want regime change, and at the same time do their best to weaken the only groups that have been capable of hurting the regime, the Islamist groups, and instead they support the groups that the Turks call the horse thieves, warlords, criminals, thugs, mafias, the Dostums and Ismail Khans of Syria, who at best control a few hills and 1 or 2 provinces. There is a slow training and arming process going on with the opposition, and if it lasts a few years, you may have an opposition army, but the pace is so slow that by the time they finish training this hypothetical army, the regime will have taken back the rest of Syria. Moreover, if you travel in opposition-held parts of Syria these days, you see that the majority of men carrying weapons aren't fighting the regime. And that's been the case for at least a year now. They're sitting in their villages, they're exhausted, or they're trying to make money, provide for their families, but they've long ago given up on the hope and the dream of reaching the presidential palace in Damascus. Everybody knows what it will take to remove the regime, or the senior levels of the regime that the so-called friends of Syria claim they want to remove. It won't take pressure. Only the people in Syria feel this pressure. It will take an American invasion, and that's not going to happen. So all the rest is deceiving yourselves and the Syrians who continue to struggle in a futile and fruitless uprising, wasting their lives for a cause that they can't achieve. And this is a cause which at this point has also lost its moral position, its conscience, and is becoming nihilistic in its actions. Now, Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, are concerned about Sunnis being killed, and that's fair. Thousands of people who happen to be Sunnis are being crushed and exploded into pieces month after month. They're not being killed because they're Sunni, but because there are insurgents living in their area, or because there are communities who support these insurgents, and the regime wants to punish these populations, or teach them a lesson, or create a divide between the population and the insurgents. But regardless, thousands of Sunnis are being killed. And of course, thousands of non-Sunnis are also being killed, as are Sunnis, by the opposition. But if you're concerned about Sunnis being killed, the solution is not to prolong the war, which seems to be the Saudi point of view. If you're concerned about saving Muslim lives, Sunni lives, freeing Sunnis from prison, ending the displacement, If you care about stopping the killing, the arrests, the car bombs, the radicalization, the flight of refugees, the destruction of a rich and ancient culture and social fabric, then you must focus on conflict resolution and ending the war, rather than the fiction of regime change. The priority must be first and foremost on ending the war in as much of Syria as possible, on reducing the killing, the displacement, and the radicalization. Now regionally, as I said before, there's not much pressure to solve this Syria as one might think. Many countries have shifted into a conflict management mode. Turkey, for example. They're managing this conflict. It's not really a big problem for them. There was a concern over spillover, but until now, Syria has been a case of spill in. The refugees are a problem, but they might even prove profitable for some countries in the long run. ISIS is more active in Iraq. That's true, but that's in part a result of Maliki's own failings and abuses as a leader. Jordan is receiving enough money that they'll probably make a profit from the refugee case eventually. Israel never has to worry about giving back the Golan Heights to Bashar al-Assad, so they couldn't be more content. And Hezbollah is busy fighting Sunnis. The Syrian army has been degraded significantly, so they're doing okay. Lebanon seems to have been through the worst and emerged relatively unscathed. And every couple of years there's a little bit of instability in Lebanon. They seem to be able to handle it. And basically since 1983, the US has declared that they don't care about Lebanon. So they're doing all right. Turkey now has increased cheap labor. And in the short term, the PKK problem has been exported into Syria. So that's a good deal for them too. Now Gulf countries are worried about Al-Qaeda, but they're content to pour more fuel into the Syrian fire without having to worry about taking in any of the refugees that they're helping to cause by prolonging the war. Anyway, regime change has become less important than counterterrorism for most of the countries and for countering extremist violence, etc. Now, of course, I should add about Turkey. Turkey is more responsible than any other country, inadvertently, not deliberately, for creating the Al-Qaeda problem in Syria by turning a blind eye to the thousands of people that were streaming through its borders. And that's important because, as a result of that, the moderate opposition that did exist at one point, that was running successful attempts at councils and local governance, was virtually destroyed, thanks to Turkish negligence of its own border. Now, Europe, to a certain extent, some other countries, the US, are worried about the Al-Qaeda threat. I think it's exaggerated, and in the short term, the new Al-Qaeda is more focused on the near enemy than the far enemy, on Shiites, Alawites, Maliki, Assad, Sisi, corrupt local rulers, hypocrites, Sunnis who are impious or puppets of the West, on their experiments to set up a caliphate in stateless zones of Syria and Iraq. And of course, from the Western point of view, the best way to provoke this new Al-Qaeda might be to attack them directly. And perhaps the best way to deal with them would be to support the opposition that would be capable of tackling them. But the choice in Syria is often falsely portrayed as al-Assad or Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda won't take over Syria no matter what. That's not the choice. The choice is war or less war. Rapid Arab Spring-style change hasn't worked anywhere in the Middle East. Libya is worse than it ever was. Egypt, despite the elections yesterday, is more authoritarian than it was under Mubarak. Syria is destroyed. So clearly, only gradual change can work in the Middle East. Now, regime change in Syria won't lead to Al-Qaeda taking over, as I said, but it would lead to total state collapse and failure. And as I saw in Iraq, or in Libya, or Somalia, once the state collapses, it's impossible to restore. It's not a defense of the regime, but the regime is so imbricated into the state that it's hard to know where one starts and where the other begins and ends. Now, there's no opposition ready to take over, even if Bashar and his inner circle left the country tomorrow. At best, the opposition can rule at the local level, and that's where they're strongest. There are many interesting experiments taking place in Syria today. Opposition experiments and local governance have largely failed, but that's mostly because of regime attacks from the sky, which force people to flee, or because of Al-Qaeda and their predations in the north, and also because of corruption and mafia-like activities, and the general problem of Syrians not being able to cooperate very well with each other. But some councils in opposition areas remain and struggle bravely to provide for their people. What the government calls reconciliation deals are far from perfect and can also be called honorable surrenders, resulting from the siege tactics of the government. But leaders of the revolution in these areas which have done reconciliations with the government are treated as partners and local leaders for the first time, and acknowledged as such by the government. So there's something very important in there. And the civilians get to return to these areas. There's at least 10 areas where this has happened so far, and they can pick up the pieces of their lives. And that's better than the alternatives, as unattractive as it is. Now, while the opposition and its supporters are a reality, and they can't be forgotten, and they shouldn't be abandoned, the regime, the Syrian state, and its supporters are also a reality, and they have real popularity and support throughout the country, whether one likes them or not. State collapse is not a solution for Syria, and neither is wiping out the opposition. Neither side can win militarily in Syria. The regime is making steady progress in securing the center and the areas that are most important to it, but it can never take the north and the south as long as the borders with Jordan and Turkey remain open. Syrians on both sides have been negotiating with each other for the last 3 years. Sometimes agreements held for a month, sometimes for a year, until radicals or war profiteers on one side or the other undermined them. Sometimes these deals led to ceasefires, to cooperation, to prisoner releases, and even to a thriving trade across front lines between pro-regime militias and anti-regime militias. The solution must be engaging with the regime and demanding huge concessions from the regime in exchange for that. This would include international observers and peacekeepers and significant decentralization to allow the opposition and the loyalists to begin practicing politics safely at the local level. The solution in the short term is neither transition nor power sharing, but freezing the war as it is and acknowledging that Syria has been decentralized at the barrel of a gun, enshrining that decentralization so Syrians can freely elect their own leaders and representatives at the local and provincial level will allow them to eventually create leaders who can compete one day at the national level. The country is already decentralized, so all I'm actually calling for is reintegrating it rather than further division. This is all going to happen eventually anyway. So the question is, do you want to wait a few more years and watch tens of thousands of people die, or get involved in a process to make it better, to protect more civilians, to create a better Syria? Or do you want to mislead the Syrian opposition with a false hope that salvation will come from the outside so they can continue their futile struggle for a few more years? In the scenario that I described, countries like Turkey, the Gulf, other states involved in the conflict can continue to have a significant role because the armed groups they support, that their proxies, their puppets, their allies and friends will become local political actors or strongmen or warlords. So they can maintain their interests because they'll be supporting these groups indefinitely. And that's about the best you can hope for. It's kind of many Lebanons in Syria. But Syria can never go back to being the state it was before 2011. It doesn't even have enough manpower to control the country the way that it used to. That's one of the reasons why it's striking these local deals, so they can farm out authority to others. The old Syria is gone, and at best, much of the country will only be loosely tied to the center, and some of the country might be ungovernable for many years. Turkey and maybe Qatar will exercise huge influence over the north and parts of the east, while Jordan, and therefore the Saudis, will exercise huge influence over the south and parts of the center. Thus, closing the borders to weapons and fighters would come at the condition that the regime accept this new reality, a looser Syria with a weaker center, in which the president and security remain, but their role is reduced, and in which strong men rule their little areas. Jamal Maruf, for example, one of the heroes of Western media lately, will be a local ruler in parts of Idlib, Abdul Razak Tlas, in Rastan, and so on and so forth. And an international force will be present in the non-Al-Qaeda areas to make sure everybody behaves. Now, Iran and Russia will be content with this because their regime stays, and therefore Hezbollah gets to keep its supply lines. This might not give you the satisfaction of justice. And in fact, justice might be a threat to peace and stability in Syria right now. The ICC referral is not only impractical because nobody's going to come in there and arrest anybody, but it also makes a solution in the short term more complicated. Now, millions of dollars have been spent on transitional justice schemes and conferences that will never be implemented. It's much more likely that transitional justice will be implemented by silenced pistols and bombs planted under the cars once the war is over. At least that's better than mass killing. But my vision, while not finding a way to bring justice to the victims, does provide a roadmap towards ending the war, allowing Syrians actually engaged in the conflict to begin cooperating in conflict resolution under international supervision and guarantees. Syria has changed irrevocably. The regime can never control the country the way it did before. Even Alawites are boiling with rage at their regime, while most Sunnis prefer the state, the regime, Bashar, anything to the opposition, which has failed to produce one attractive model, or has been made to fail by a combination of broken promises from its allies, the regime's lethal bombardments, and Al-Qaeda and criminal groups and others. On the other hand, the loyalists have been changed irrevocably too. They openly criticize the regime and Bashar. You have Shabiha going on strike, demanding better conditions. You have Shabiha fighting each other and necessitating bringing the Minister of National Reconciliation to solve a dispute between them. You have Alawites openly criticizing the regime, and millions of Sunnis who fled into Alawite and Baathi areas, preferring the state that exists there to the chaos that exists in opposition areas. So Syria is much more complex than has been portrayed, and the solution is far more complex and gradual. Focusing on ending the war can create openings for politics and for local accountability. Now, who can broker these deals? We've mentioned neighboring countries. We haven't mentioned the one organization that can actually do it, and that's the UN. The removal of Brahimi creates an opening, because the regime wasn't going to deal with Brahimi. Now, the UN leadership in Damascus now, under Yaqub El-Helu, the resident coordinator, has done some incredible work winning credibility on both sides. And it's shown that it can be effective, it's shown both sides it can deliver, and it's been able to extract huge concessions from the regime, unprecedented ones. Not as great as we might like, but in terms of protecting civilians who have left opposition areas, getting the regime to stick to its agreement, the UN has shown that it can actually do that. And Martin Griffiths, the replacement for Lamani in Damascus, is also respected by both sides. Now, the great thing about the UN is that it relieves it relieves countries of individual responsibility, and it's a convenient scapegoat if things go wrong. So the greatest hope for negotiating the kind of deals that I'm proposing won't come from Iran or Saudi Arabia or other countries. It'll come from those countries backing what will inevitably have to be UN efforts on the ground.
NIR, thanks very much. I do want to come straight back at you with a question, which is, it's implicit in what you just said, but I want to ask you, is your understanding that the UN on the ground, at least, wants to be given this expanded role?
Some of them do. Now, there's a political tension because on the one hand, the UN is involved in sort of regime change activities. On the other hand, the UN is a key partner with the regime when it comes to humanitarian assistance in the government-held parts of the country, and of course in some of the deals that have been implemented. The best example being the Homs deal. There were two separate incidents in Homs. In February 2014, the UN brought in food and medicine and extracted about 1,500 civilians. Under direct mortar fire and machine gun fire from the NDF, I should add. It was like the UN from the 90s, not the cautious UN we know in the last 10 years in the Middle East. But they were able to pressure the regime so that of the 2,000 people who eventually left old homes, only 14 are right now in prison. Some were in prison and were released. Anyway, it should have been much worse. We would have expected much worse to happen. And it would have been much worse were it not for the UN involvement, pressuring the governor, talking to security chiefs. Likewise, the UN was involved in the extraction of 2,300 fighters from old homes a couple of weeks ago, and guaranteeing that they would be safe going on buses up to northern Homs, at the same time as delivering food aid to two Shia villages in Aleppo and helping release women and children being held by the opposition in Latakia. Very complex deal. It's far outside the mandate you would expect from the UN, but really pushing the envelope. Anyway, from conversations with the UN, I know that the leadership that has been appointed to or is currently in Damascus, they do have this attitude. Now, obviously, there's limitations what they can do. They're short on staff. You're still working in a situation where the regime has a huge amount of power and is unchecked. But there are many examples where the UN activity on the ground, pressure on the regime, has shown that they can deliver much more than would otherwise have occurred, and that they can provide much greater guarantees for pro-opposition civilians and even for armed groups that the regime has branded terrorists, even for Jabhat al-Nusra, for example.